By the 16th century, Europe had pretty much recovered from the 14th century crisis. The Renaissance and humanism, which started out in Italy, had ended the pessimism and despair the 14th century had brought. Population growth, beginning around 1416, continuing on for the better part of 100 years, was ending the depopulation brought on by the plague years. Economic expansion caused by, number one, population growth, and number two, the influx of American treasure, had ended the economic depression, which stretched from about 1350 to 1450. We're also going to see in this period and in this lecture that there's significant political restructuring and rebuilding going on, and that has to do with the birth of what we call new monarchy. New monarchy in this 15th, 16th century is a rebuilding of royal government's monarchy that had collapsed in the 14th century crisis. You might recall from one of the first lectures in the course that medieval monarchy, which was really very different from what we're going to see evolving in the Renaissance and Reformation period, had been based on a partnership and cooperation between the king and the important nobles of the kingdom, because these important nobles were very wealthy, very powerful, and the king really couldn't rule without their help and consent. But this cooperation, this partnership, which caused medieval monarchy to work, had collapsed in the 14th century, largely due to the pressures of warfare and other economic conditions. As we've seen before, the long, expensive wars, like the 100 Years' War between England and France, had driven a wedge between the king and nobles. The king is now having to hire mercenary soldiers, he's having to buy firearms, he's not able to rely on the nobles anymore as his knights in armor and fighting wars for him essentially for free. So he's got a lot of economic problems, and the king kept on going back to the nobles asking for more and more money to fight wars, more and more contributions. And they did make their contributions, but after a while they just got fed up with it, and they said, we're not going to pay any more money. The king insisted they pay more money. They refused. And essentially the king and nobles became more adversaries than partners by the end of the 14th century. So that was a real problem. And when the structure of monarchy breaks down like that, kings just became unable to really govern their kingdoms. Another factor was that nobles themselves were declining in power. They were fighting civil wars with each other in the 14th century, killing each other off, spending lots of money doing that. The economic depression came in and hit their landed wealth and drove prices and profits down. So nobles are declining in power, and the monarchy can't rely on them anymore. And even kings are just losing tremendous amounts of power by the end of the 14th century because warfare has exhausted their treasuries, and their partners in government have turned away from them, and they just don't really have very many options left. So medieval monarchy really collapsed in the 14th century. By about 1450, we start to see monarchy being rebuilt, but on very different foundations than before, and it's going to become a very different animal than it was before. In the first case, I'll just go through some of the differences here, and then we'll look at some specific examples of new monarchs and what they did. One thing that happens is that kings attempt to replace nobles in government with middle-class officials. Now, at this early stage, we're talking about 15th, 16th century, there's only so much of that you can do. There are going to be nobles in the government because there are still powerful nobles here and there, and you can't get rid of all of them. But the kings are attempting whenever they can to take nobles out of office and put loyal middle-class bureaucrats who just follow orders in office to make the government more responsive to what the king wants. So that's one aspect. The second aspect that's happening is that wealthy middle-class merchants, bankers and industrialists, etc., are actually purchasing government office, and they're purchasing nobility, both of these from the king. And this has a significant impact on government, as we'll see in a few minutes. These middle-class people who purchase office and nobility are going to turn into a new professional administrative class, which is going to be the main staff for this new monarchy, this new kind of government. So the king is going to attempt to rule without nobles as much as possible, and with the aid of middle-class bureaucrats and their money. Because don't forget that nobles can't be taxed, but middle-class people can be taxed. They're commoners. And so the king becomes extremely reliant on taxing the middle class. That's another aspect of the way monarchy is rebuilt. And finally, kings need to build large new bureaucracies and large new armies to enforce their power. Bureaucracies largely to collect taxes, and armies both to fight foreign opponents and to fight domestic opposition. And both of these are differences. Big bureaucracies and armies are differences from the Middle Ages. Medieval monarchy really did not involve big bureaucracy. Most medieval kings, the entire central government was their court, and their household officials, the chamberlain, the chancellor, the constable, the steward, the marshal, people like that. A very small circle of people who ran the central government, and even tax collecting was contracted out to independent agents. And so there really weren't large bureaucracies at all in medieval monarchy. So this is going to be a big change. And also medieval armies were small. Until the 14th century, at least, they were small, and they were fairly cheap when you could just call on your nobles to fight for you. So these big new professional armies is going to be another big change that we're going to see happening in monarchy. This is really the beginning of the evolution of what you might call the modern military bureaucratic state. Although it's a long process. It's going to start, say, around 1450, continue on through the 17th century into the 18th century, but this is the beginning point. And there are very definite social consequences to these kind of changes. Nobles are declining in power. Now, true, they start out, as the top group in society. They have a lot of power, so they have a long way to decline, but they really are declining. They have a lesser role in government than they used to. Because middle-class people are buying nobility, there's a phenomenon known as the inflation of nobility, which means the more nobles there are, the less each noble title is worth, and the less prestige each noble has. And that's also hurting noble power. On the other hand, the power of the middle classes is going up. They have more role in government, although in this early stage it's still, it's just kind of getting started. They have more political power in the new monarchy, and they have great wealth, which they make in the economic expansion, in trade, in industry, in banking, and areas like that. So we're starting to see a trend that really will continue through the 18th century, in fact, through the end of this course, the decline of nobility and rise of the middle class. And it's really connected to changes in the state as well as in society. Well, what exactly set off this change in monarchy? What started the growth of new monarchy? You might look back and say, well, monarchy in the Middle Ages, in the 14th century, it collapsed, so they had to rebuild it, they had to do something. But there wasn't that immediate recognition that something could be done or what should be done. It really was more economic conditions which forced things to happen and actually molded this new image, this new shape of monarchy. And we're talking here about the economic expansion that is a result of geographical expansion into the Americas. We're talking about the inflation, the price climbs, all through the 16th century. Expansion and especially inflation means that it just simply cost kings a lot more money to run the government than it ever had cost them before. And they simply have to find a way to get this money. Other things that are costing them even more money, firearms are advancing, getting more complex, more expensive, artillery, handheld firearms, all this you have to purchase for your military, the use of mercenaries, all that's causing the cost of government doing business as a ruler to increase. So really the only thing kings can do in this situation is they have to increase taxes. And to increase taxes, they have to get someone to go out and collect these taxes. So they have to get a big bureaucracy to collect the taxes that they need to feed their expenses, especially their military machine. And we see them relying more and more on the sale of office and the sale of nobility. Now, both of these things are not really new. In France, at least, the sale of office goes back into the 13th century to Philip Augustus, and other countries almost that far. But in the Middle Ages, it was a small thing. It wasn't really a major thing. Now the sale of office starts to become a major source of royal revenue, and kings become dependent on it. And they've got to go on selling offices. And the more they sell, they have to create more to keep selling more because they sell them all out. And this creates a problem. And there are other problems that sale of office creates that we'll see later on in the course. Sale of nobility is also a case in point. Kings do it for financial gain now. In the Middle Ages, it really hadn't been a source of big revenues. Now it's becoming a source of big revenues, and also causing increased tension between king and nobles who don't want to have their titles devalued. Big new armies to enforce royal rule, big new bureaucracies. This is all something very new, and something in a way very modern, which just marks it as a different system from the Middle Ages. Okay, let's take a look now at some specific examples of new monarchies and how they developed. And we'll start off in France, and we'll continue on with Spain, England, and some other examples. In France, in the 15th century, before the real beginning of new monarchy, the kings were hampered by a number of things. They were hampered by the fact that nobles were still fairly strong. So strong, especially local nobles, could create opposition. And they were hampered by the fact that the king still had, at this early stage, a pretty small central government. So he didn't really have the power to reach out and control all areas of the country. Another problem the French king had was that a large part of his tax revenues had to be voted by local assemblies known as estates. These estates were usually provincial estates, provincial assemblies. They were representative assemblies where the three different estates, the nobles, the clergy, and the commoners, would all send their deputies to meet and hear the king's plea for money, and then they would have the ability to vote yes or no on whether they would grant new taxes in their province for the king. There were a few taxes that the French king could just levy directly, like the tile and a few others, but they didn't make up nearly enough revenue for the royal government to prosper. So having to have these local votes on taxes was a real problem, and the king often got turned down. Stack that up against the fact that even at this early stage, the royal army ate up fully 1/2 of the king's total revenue. So that means that these early kings of France in the 15th century have a real revenue problem. Well, Louis XI, who becomes king in 1461 and rules till 1483, takes over the French monarchy, the French throne, at a low point, at the very end of the 100 Years' War, which France had sort of won, but it bankrupted the country. The country was ungovernable. It was torn up by war. It really was just a disaster. And Louis had to figure out some way to rebuild the monarchy in the country from this terrible low point it was at. To make matters worse, one of the French nobles, the Duke of Burgundy, who ruled Burgundy, a substantial province in the south, had become so powerful that he was essentially an independent ruler. And he was a rival of the King of France for power in France. So much so that he even expanded his power into the Netherlands and the Low Countries and was building, in fact, his own state. And you could say in a way that in this early period, Burgundy was not a part of France because the Duke was so powerful and such a thorn in the side of the king. And probably the most important thing Louis XI does is he goes to war against Burgundy, he wears them down, and he defeats the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, in 1477 and brings Burgundy back into allegiance to France, which is really the King of France, which is a big step. Because if they'd lost Burgundy, if it had become an independent nation, then the king would have been seriously weakened. The next king, Charles VIII, who rules from 1483 to 1498, is the one who invades Italy. He has this claim